Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Hasini Andihetti and joining me is Dr. Jordan Harrison. We are both from the University of Gloucestershire in the United Kingdom. This presentation focuses on identifying behavioral decision-making profiles using cybersecurity simulation log data. To begin, I'll hand over to Jordan to explain why decision-making matters in cybersecurity education.
Thanks, Essini. So yes, I'm Dr. John Allison, a senior lecturer in computer science at the University of Gloucestershire. So cybersecurity education has traditionally placed a strong emphasis on technical skill development through activities such as technical labs, capture the flag competitions, and hackathons. These approaches are valuable because they help students develop technical and practical capabilities in areas such as vulnerability analysis, exploitation, and defensive techniques. However, cybersecurity practice extends beyond this technical execution. Real-world cybersecurity professionals are frequently required to make complex decisions under uncertainty, and there's not often a perfect solution. This involves judging risk, balancing competing organisational priorities, communicating effectively with stakeholders, and considering the human and organisational consequences of technical decisions. For example, a security professional may need to decide whether to immediately restrict access to protect systems, or maintain operational availability to support business functions. These decisions require more than just technical knowledge. They require judgment, communication, and an understanding of organisational context. Therefore, cybersecurity education should provide students with opportunities to practice decision making alongside technical skills. Developing the ability to evaluate situations, consider trade offs, and justify decisions is essential for preparing students to operate effectively in real world cybersecurity environments. We therefore developed a decision-making simulation game for students to make decisions regarding cybersecurity. Hassini will now explain this in further depth.
Thanks, Jordan. The simulation takes students through 15 organizational incidents. For each incident, they choose one of three responses, and each choice affects security, budget, reputation, staff morale, and board happiness. The final score shows where participants ended up, but the decision log shows the choices that led them there. That is why the analysis focused on the decision log data. As shown here, when a student selects a response, the simulation displays the outcome and updates the scores. Students can also review the decisions they have made and see how each one affected their scores. At the same time, each decision is saved in a log, including scenario, selected response, outcome, and changes to the file metrics. The next slide shows how these decision logs are prepared for analysis. For each playthrough, the decision logs were collected in both PDF and JSON formats. The PDFs made it easier to view students' decisions and their impacts, while the JSON files provided the structured data needed for analysis. The JSON files from 136 playthroughs were then cleaned and combined into one dataset, giving 2009 individual decisions. This includes 125 complete runs and 11 that ended early, which means that if the students went bankrupt, the game was over. So, which were also kept because they still showed meaningful decision behavior. Once the data was ready, the 45 response options were coded across four behavioral dimensions and linked to the decision logs. The proportion of each behavior was then calculated for every playthrough, creating behavioral profiles for each run. Jordan will explain this coding on the next slide. These profiles were then used for clustering. After comparing different methods and numbers of clusters, a four-cluster k-means solution was selected, showing four different patterns of student behavior, which will be explained later. Only after that were the final outcome scores added, so the profiles were based on the decisions students made rather than their final scores. I'll now hand over to Jordan to explain the four behavioral dimensions and how the response options were coded.
Thanks, Hassini. So to systematically analyse player decision making, a behavioural coding framework was developed to identify the underlying decision logic behind each choice. rather than simply recording the action taken. The framework was informed by literature on risk governance, crisis management, organisational decision making, cybersecurity response, and human centred governance, which highlights recurring tensions between security, operational continuity, accountability, transparency, and stakeholder well-being. So, our coding framework consisted of four complementary dimensions: decision orientation, risk management, human elements, and the transparency of that decision. So, the first dimension of decision orientation captured the main strategic objective behind a decision. Choices were coded according to whether they prioritise security, operational continuity, human well-being, financial efficiency, governance and accountability, or whether they represented an explicit balancing of competing objectives. The second dimension of managing risk examined how players approached uncertainty and threats. Decisions were classified as preventative, containment focused, investigative, reactive, or risk accepting, reflecting established distinctions within risk management and crisis response. The third dimension of human elements captured how decisions engage with affected individuals. Choices were coded as supportive, neutral, enforcement orientated, or surveillance focused, recognising that organisational responses involve not only technical consideration, but also issues of trust, authority, compliance, and behavioural management. The final dimension, transparency of the decision, examined how information was handled. Decisions were classified as open and transparent, selectively disclosed, or concealed. Importantly, decisions could contain multiple characteristics across these dimensions rather than being restricted to a single category. This allowed complex decision patterns to be represented within a common behavioural feature space and enabled comparison between participants and later clustering analysis to identify decision-making archetypes. To assess reliability, two independent coders coded all 45 scenario choices across the four domain areas, producing 180 individual coding decisions. They agreed on 154 classifications, which represented an 85.6% agreement. Cohen's kappa was then calculated to account for chance agreement, producing an overall mean value Cohen's kappa of 0.805, indicating really strong inter-rater reliability. Overall, this coding framework provided a theoretically grounded method for examining how participants balanced organisational objectives, risk, human considerations, and information disclosure during complex decision scenarios. I'll now hand back to Sini, who will share the results of the clustering.
Thanks, Jordan. Now let's look at the four profiles that came out of the clustering. Before looking at them, it is important to point out that scores at the bottom were added after the groups had been formed, which I mentioned previously when I talked about the analytical workflow. They did not influence the clustering, they simply show how each decision making approach was reflected in the final results. The clearest finding is that more than half of the runs were adaptive balances. These runs did not focus on only one area, instead, they balanced security, resources, staff, and communication, which also led to fairly balanced final results. The other three profiles show clearer trade offs. Protective controllers put security first and achieved the highest security and reputation scores, but this came at the greatest cost. Surveillance regulators relied more on monitoring and controlling. They maintained reasonable security but finished with lower staff morale and reputation. Detached operators accepted more risks and kept the most remaining budget. However, they finished with lowest security, reputation, and staff morale scores. So, these profiles show that each group approached the same cybersecurity situations differently, and those decisions reflect in their final outcomes. This gives a much richer understanding than looking at the final scores alone. The next slide looks at what these findings can add to learning analytics. So, what does this add to learning analytics? Final scores show the result, but decision logs show the path each student took to reach it. This means that students with similar final scores may still have followed very different decision making patterns. The main educational contribution is a practical way of turning these simulation logs into evidence that educators can use during debriefing. For example, if a student achieved strong security by relying heavily on enforcement, the educator could use the log to discuss not only the strong results but also how those decisions affected staff morale, trust, and reputation. This can help students look back their choices, understand the trade-offs they made, and consider how they might respond differently. It could also support more personalized feedback based on how each student approach risk, people, and communication. In the future, this information could be used to adapt the simulation to different decision styles and support more detailed learner modeling. So, the real value is not simply identifying the profiles, but using them to create more meaningful reflection and better support student learning. That brings the presentation to an end. We hope you find it useful and that it highlighted the value of looking beyond final scores. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions or would like to discuss the work further, please feel free to contact Dr. Jordan Allison. His contact details are shown on the slide.